All right, let's just dive right into this explainer. We are looking at the profound, absolute tidal wave of forces that completely remade America from 1989 all the way up to the present. We're talking about a period where the world didn't just change, right? It practically shrank. As the old Cold War barriers finally fell, the United States suddenly found itself navigating this deeply interconnected and honestly sometimes chaotic new reality. Now, before we get into the nitty gritty events, we absolutely have to define globalization. Essentially, it's the shrinking of the world through incredibly rapid economic and technological integration. Think of it as the lightning fast spread of capitalism, this massive surge in global trade, and the explosion of communications technology. It suddenly linked people, markets, and nations in ways that were literally unimaginable just a generation earlier. But, as you might guess, the immediate backlash to all of this was fierce. Just look at this scene. Riot police clashing with protesters in Seattle over the World Trade Organization back in 1999. Over 50,000 people took to the streets. They represented a diffuse but very intense fear that this new system of free trade was really only going to benefit multinational corporations, leaving everyday workers and the environment completely in the dust. It was a massive wake-up call that globalization wasn't just going to be universally celebrated. But the stakes were actually way higher than just global trade, because the exact same open borders and communication networks that spread all that wealth, they also enabled the shocking tragedy of September 11th. The attacks were tragically made possible by this new era. The 19 hijackers trained globally, they studied in Western nations, and they coordinated a devastating strike using the internet, email, and cell phones. It became painfully clear that the very openness central to globalization also introduced some truly unprecedented vulnerabilities. So, to make sense of these massive, sweeping trends, we're going to follow a quick agenda today. We'll start with America's overarching twin dilemmas, then move on to the global economy's rise, the information age, new waves of immigration, and finally, we'll wrap up with the resulting culture wars. All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the Twin Dilemmas, Navigating a New World Order. So, post Cold War America basically found itself forced into this really precarious balancing act. On the outside, the external dilemma: how do you engage in massive global commerce while simultaneously fighting decentralized terror and managing newly emerging nations? And on the inside, the internal dilemma: how do you manage explosive cultural shifts and protect your citizens when their jobs can now be outsourced in a heartbeat? The country had to figure out how to maintain internal stability while aggressively expanding its footprint globally. It's a tough spot to be in. Moving right along to Section 2, the global economy's rise, markets without borders. Okay, so the global stage was transforming incredibly fast. What we're seeing here is the spectacular rise of China's exports, competing directly with the US right alongside the massive geographic expansion of the European Union. By the late 1990s, the EU had basically formed a single federal state dynamic, accounting for a fifth of all global imports and exports. Meanwhile, China quadrupled its gross domestic product between 2000 and 2008. They fully embraced capitalism to become an absolute manufacturing juggernaut. And this whole massive global shift was really driven by multinational corporations. Just look at this number. They exploded from just 7,000 in 1970 to a staggering 63,000 by the year 2000. I mean, that's not just growth, that is an explosion. These companies were the true engines of globalization. They were constantly seeking new markets, consolidating wealth, and completely rewriting the rules of international business. Now, to ground those big, abstract corporate numbers in human reality, let's look at this massive Nike plant in China from 2005. It perfectly illustrates the controversial corporate quest for ever cheaper sources of labor. Multinationals were closing American factories and outsourcing jobs to places like Mexico, Eastern Europe, and Asia. In massive facilities like this one, workers, who were mostly young women, earned about $3 a day. It really highlights the profound tension between us wanting cheap consumer goods back home and the stark, difficult realities of global labor. Which brings us to Section 3, the information age and the tech pivot. And wow, did this tech pivot happen fast? We literally leaped from a decentralized 1960s military network called ARPANET straight to the 1991 debut of the World Wide Web, which, almost overnight, sparked billions in e-commerce. By 2010, e-commerce transactions were nearing $500 billion. This technology didn't just change business, though. It fundamentally altered human interaction, how we spend our leisure time, and how we access knowledge. A real game changer. But of course, that disruption was incredibly severe. These empty newspaper boxes serve as a really ominous sign of the times. Free internet access ruthlessly destroyed legacy industries that just couldn't adapt fast enough. Dozens of robust, established newspapers simply vanished into thin air between 2000 and 2010. It shows us that the information age was a massive double-edged sword, offering this incredible democratic access to information while entirely upending the livelihoods of folks working in traditional media. Now let's bring it back closer to home with Section 4, New Waves of Immigration and Shifting Demographics. So the origins of immigration into the U.S. dramatically shifted away from Europe and heavily towards Latin America and Asia. Between 1970 and 2000, the U.S. population grew by 77 million people, right? And immigrants accounted for 28 million of that increase. The overwhelming majority of these new arrivals came from Latin America, about 16 million, and East Asia, bringing in about 9 million. And here's the wild part. This total demographic transformation was actually the unintended result of the 1965 Immigration Act, also known as the Hart-Celler Act. It eliminated those old rigid quota systems and instead favored family reunification. It allowed immediate family members of those already legally living in the country to enter outside of the normal numerical limits. And that led to a massive, self-sustaining chain of migration that fundamentally reshaped the entire American populace. Now, looking at this impartially, it's clear this caused friction. Critics like Roy Beck, quoted here in 1996, argued that a massive influx like this inevitably created intense strain on local job markets and social fabrics. From this perspective, the sheer volume of new arrivals led to overcrowded schools, congested infrastructure, and real fears that American workers were being displaced. It sparked intense, ongoing debates about what level of immigration a society can actually handle successfully. But on the flip side, proponents really echoed the sentiments of John F. Kennedy. They emphasized that America's core democratic experiment actually relies on being generous and welcoming to the oppressed. Supporters pointed out that immigrants brought critically needed talents, ambition, and this incredible energy that served as an engine for economic progress. They argued that, far from being a burden, this influx of diverse, hardworking people was exactly what kept the United States so globally competitive. These dueling perspectives naturally bring us to our final topic, Section 5, Culture Wars and Identity, the Domestic Reaction. So during this time, the whole cultural paradigm fundamentally shifted. We moved away from this old idea of an assimilating melting pot and towards a new concept, multiculturalism. The melting pot implied that everyone would eventually just blend into a single dominant American culture. But in the 1990s, multiculturalism suggested something entirely different, a diverse set of ethnic and racial groups working together, bound by shared public values, but fiercely maintaining their unique, distinct traditions. And this wasn't just some abstract academic debate. It became a physical reality in places like California, which rapidly approached what's called majority-minority status. Heavy concentrations of new demographic groups completely reshaped specific states. By 2010, African Americans, Latinos, and Asians together actually constituted a majority of California's residents. This profound reality meant the culture wars were being fought daily in local communities and right at the ballot box. All of this resulting anxiety sparked massive political flashpoints across the 1990s. In California, voters passed measures actively banning affirmative action and bilingual education. Measures like Proposition 209 and 227 showed a stark, undeniable backlash against multicultural policies. Meanwhile, the culture wars expanded nationwide into these incredibly intense partisan battles between religious traditionalists and secular liberals over huge issues like abortion rights, divorce laws, and the very definition of the family itself. Which leads us to a final, pretty provocative thought to take away from this explainer today. How will any nation manage its cultural conflicts and ensure economic opportunity in an inevitably globalized society? We've seen how deeply interconnected trade, technology, and human migration are, and we've seen the intense domestic friction they can create. The profound forces that shook the world starting back in 1989, well, they haven't stopped. They are the exact same forces we are all still navigating today. Thanks for joining me on this one.